Welcome to Planet People Mining Season 2. I'm your host, Allison Koppel. Here we present the stories of trailblazers at the crossroads of mining, sustainability, and communities. Hear what motivates top professionals in this field of impactful work. Accompany them as they describe their challenges and explore the issues they tackle. And for our Spanish-speaking audience, busca Planet People Mining en español. Honoring trauma so we can build something better with Estelle Levin-Nally. Today I speak with Estelle Levin-Nally, CEO and founder of the B Corp advisory firm Levin Sources, which has helped over 160 clients mine, trade, source, invest in, and regulate minerals more responsibly since 2010. Estelle herself holds a number of international roles, including for the G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council, the Global Investor Commission for Mining 2030, and she is chair of the Investing in African Mining Indaba's Sustainability Committee. Estelle was recognized as a top 100 global inspirational woman in mining by WIM UK in 2020. For those who may be triggered from mentions of violence and trauma, you may not want to listen to this episode. We speak about how our understanding of other people's traumatic experiences have informed our drive and practice, and how, as an industry, understanding and respecting the traumas that may exist in communities and by stakeholders enables a stronger ability to build trust and accelerate mining. Estelle, I'm really excited you're on the podcast. Before I break my voice to let you speak, I just wanted to say, we sat next to each other at one of the best parties in mining, the Women in Mining Denver Gala. And the whole night you had just a mix of interesting stories and making me laugh the whole time. And yet the whole time I was listening to you saying, please be on my podcast, please be on my podcast. And here we are. So thank you, Estelle, for joining the podcast.
You're so welcome, Alison. But the things that I say privately at WIM Denver dinner over a glass of wine may not be the things I will share in the podcast. So we'll see if it's as exciting.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, listen, why don't we start off by introducing yourself beyond what I shared in the bio? What are a few major life and work milestones?
Okay, so maybe for people to understand me and who I am, there are some things that I'm most proud of, perhaps, or I think that show my identity, and maybe that is what I'll share. So the first thing is that I had a really privileged childhood. I was really lucky. I was born to parents who were mixed race, mixed religion, and were 36 years apart. So when I was really little, because of some challenges they faced in their community in Glasgow, we moved to a little island called Guernsey, which is in the English Channel, very close to France. And it's where I call home. And I had a wonderful upbringing. I was safe. We could explore and run around this beautiful island. It didn't mean we didn't get into trouble. We certainly did. But I was very protected, I suppose, as a child. And for that, I'm really grateful and aware. And one of the things I did as a child was I built a passion for learning. And that has stayed with me all my life. And I think in some ways shapes why I chose to found Levin Sources and why I choose to continue to work in what I do. Because in my role, I learn every day and I grow and I change and evolve every day. And that excites me. But the other thing I was able to do as a child was explore music. And I absolutely love music. I learned several instruments. And I got to a stage where I had to make a decision. Am I either going to be a musician or am I going to do something else? Do the academic stuff that I was also interested in. And I had a greater confidence around the academic stuff. So I went for that. But that love of music, that need for self-expression, for creativity, for performance and entertaining people, like women gala dinners. It kind of sits deeply within my character. Another thing that was really formative was that because my dad was so much older than my mom, they waited until I had completed my finals of my undergraduate degree to tell me that my father was dying. And I was set up to go and do a master's, LSE, actually in imperial history of all things. And I kind of went into a period of complete indecision, didn't know what to do, then decided I just needed to go home and be with my dad because if he was going to die, I needed to make the most of that time with him. So I came home, and as someone who'd been extraordinarily ambitious and in theory was just beginning her life, I came home on a ticket that I didn't know how long it would last. And I was a bit lost, I guess. And I have a lot of gratitude to two people. The first was the person that gave me a job at that time, Chris Blinn, who brought me in to teach English and to help him run his translation business. And he's a highly principled entrepreneurial guy. And I saw what it was to be a business owner. And that resonated for me. And then the other person I'm grateful to is my friend Claire Greer, who called me up one day and said, look, you're going to be stuck there. I don't know what you're going to do. Let's book this thing to raise money for cancer and cycle over the Hangai Mountains in Mongolia. So I said yes to Claire, and we signed up for this bike ride, and I had to do loads of fundraising. I did it through gigs, my own, others. I ran wine tastings, did a range of stuff and got on the radio and built a website and ended up doing the bike ride 2 weeks after my dad passed away when I was 23. And that was a really, really difficult experience. So it was an extraordinary year, and I think did a lot to shape me. It forced me to slow down. It gave me quite a lot of life lessons at a very formative stage. And although it threw me into a year of utter chaos, emotionally, and kind of a sense of feeling lost, it was a monumental and important part of my life and who I am. And I got a small inheritance from my dad that was his life insurance policy, which I used to found Levin Sources in 2010. So in a way, the company that I still own and love and work through was founded also from his love and protection of me.
Wow, I just learned a lot about you. The hairs on my arms are standing up. What a powerful story. How would you describe your current role and why your work now is important?
So I'm the CEO of the company I founded, Levin Sources, and I run the company with my business partner, Holger Grundle, who's the managing director. So in very simple terms, he basically runs the business, manages the team. I do a lot of the public relations work and sales. So sometimes as projects come in that it has to be me, but obviously what I want to do is put as many projects as I can to my team who are just amazing and to also allow us to do a lot more. So it's a real mix between, I guess, thought leadership, sector influence, impact, as well as project delivery, and of course, working as a team at Levin Sources. But I think the reason it's important is because, we're a social venture. So we're not your conventional consulting firm, and we're not an NGO. We are a commercial enterprise that is driven by its mission to build just and sustainable minerals value chains. And that means we can marry that heart and head that I think conventional business sometimes struggles with, and the charity sector may sometimes struggle with to get it right from a profitable point of view. And it means that we can really work with organizations in all parts of the mineral system as a critical friend and advisor. Because that's one of the things I've come to realize is that our real specialism is helping people within their relationships. That's me coming back to my Jewish matchmaking roots. But like Levin Sources, we will help companies work with their business partners better to not just drive greater impact, but to control risk better and to achieve their commercial objectives better. And that's really a niche of ours, and that's pretty cool and exciting. So a lot of it is about human relationships, and it's about structures and concepts that help drive cooperation. But the other thing that I think we're known for is kind of pushing the frontier. We will work with organizations at any stage of the maturity curve when it comes to sustainability and responsible business conduct. So whether people are just coming to it and figuring out what to do for the first time, or whether they're market leaders that want to be the change, live the change, drive the change, we work with companies and organizations all along that. But what we continue to do through that learning disposition and through that commitment to sustainability, right, is sit there at the frontier and go, okay, what do we need to be looking at next? And supporting our community to, on the one hand, understand what the recent priorities are and become au fait with delivering on those, but then also see what's coming and what's on the horizon. And that shaping, that nurturing role is a large part of what I do as I lead on public affairs. And that's why I think it's important.
On the one hand, I'm in a deep exploration process right now as I'm growing Patch Associates to learn about different entrepreneurial ventures in this space and your model. And I really love how you described it as marrying this concept as a mission driven commercial venture, which allows you that commitment and allows you that alignment of mission and of growth and of being able to serve your clients. So I'm going to personally take that nugget. And,
Do. And actually, there's a structure for that, which is B Corporation.
of
So,
course.
and we were, I
Yeah.
think, the first B Corporation in our sector, which
Yeah.
I'm super proud of. And that was hard because B Corporation had some limitations on mining and organizations that work in conflict affected areas that we had to work very hard to pass, right? But I think there's a huge scope for social enterprise advisory firms, and I'd love to see many more do it. And I think, from what I understand, Alison, from what you're delivering and doing with your social performance advisory, is very much that is the heart and ethos of Patch Consultants. So yeah, I'm happy to always help you think about that more.
Oh, thank you. So we started in the beginning of this origin story that was very personal and just heard about, the work you're doing now. And in this trajectory, at what point did you say, this is it? This isn't a temporary thing. This isn't just what I'm doing now. This is what I'm doing. This is my career path. Was there a moment or specific moments where that light bulb went off?
Yeah, it's like there was a gradual tightening of the belt until it fitted me, right? So I first knew that I wanted to work in something that didn't harm people. And then I knew I wanted to work in something that, beyond not harming people, could actually limit and prevent harm. So I got interested in sustainability way back in the 90s. I knew that it was something to do with sustainability. And when I left Edinburgh after my dad died, so Edinburgh was my degree place. I came back to Guernsey when my dad died. I got a job in trade. I wanted to work in international trade because I had come to understand through my degree the importance of trade as a mechanism through which harm can be locked in or can be avoided and benefit can be accrued. And so I decided to work in the dirtiest trade I could find. And I was lucky enough that Clarkson Research Services, which was the research arm, I don't know if it's still around, of one of the world's largest ship brokers, gave me a role as their oil and tanker trades analyst. So I was the one that was doing the forecasting, the reporting that allowed ship brokers to set their rules. So I knew it was going to be something to do with sustainability and with trade. And then I intentionally worked in something that was deeply unsustainable at that time to see what the worst could look like. And then I continued to read and engage with the literature on sustainability. And I went, I just have to go and study this. So I ended up applying for a scholarship, went to Canada to do my master's. And it was in the context of my master's in geography, where I was specializing in, I was building my own course in sustainability, really, that I did a course with Philippe Le Bihan and Karen Backer on environmental sustainability. They made us write a term paper, and we had to pick anything we wanted to pick. And we'd explored all these different concepts and ways of thinking about sustainability, in particular, thinking about the nature piece of sustainability. And I was doing another course on human ecology, and I met a guy from Rwanda who told me about conflict coltan in Eastern DRC. And I thought, that sounds fascinating and really troubling. So this was back in 2003, early 2004. So I decided to write a paper on it. And I wrote that paper, and it was painful. It was painful because I wrote about the business case for constructive engagement in conflict affected areas, basically, and the role of trade and trading partners in either driving conflict or helping abate conflict. And it forced me to really interrogate what I meant when I spoke about sustainability, because a lot of people, so many different definitions of it. The Brundtland definition for me is inadequate because it only speaks about justice over time, and it only speaks about it from the perspective of humanity. And I wanted to figure out what that meant. And if I then took that definition of sustainability and applied it to the case of conflict coltan in DRC, where would it lead me? Should companies continue to source from that geography, or should they disengage? And I was reading things that were deeply upsetting. I was reading things about rape using wooden sticks as a weapon of war. I was reading about the decimation of gorilla populations. And I've always been extraordinarily passionate about nature and other species with whom we share the planet. And it really connected with me emotionally, but it also felt like a fit because this was about trade, this was about sustainability, and this was about natural resources. And my dad had been a timber merchant, so that there was a bit of that connectedness to natural resources. And I was hooked. And when I wrote that paper, there were a couple of days, I remember it. I remember my husband now, who was my boyfriend at the time, saying, "What is wrong with you?" Because I actually was nonverbal, because I was just digesting everything that I was reading. And as people know me know, I am rarely nonverbal. And it was just this profound boom. And after I wrote the paper and Philippe marked it, he pulled me aside and he said, "Look, that was really good. Do you want to do more of this?" And I said, "Uh-huh." And he said, "Okay, well, I have an opportunity with USAID. Long may they rest in peace, because they have done amazing work, for you to go to Sierra Leone if you want to, and act as an intern on this project on peace diamonds. Do you want to do that?" And I said in a heartbeat, yes. But it meant I had to tell my other supervisor that although I had written 90% of my thesis on his research program, I wanted to do something different. And John Robinson, just love him so much. I actually genuinely love John Robinson deeply. And I told him this recently, and he didn't pull back, and he told me he loved me too. And that felt amazing. But he said to me, he said, "All right, then off you go." And he agreed to let me do it. So yeah, with their support, I headed off to Sierra Leone within 3 months of writing that paper on Congo, and did my thesis.
Wow. A lot of response to that. One is to touch upon the heavier aspects of hearing your story and just fortunately not being personally exposed to that level of trauma, but just even being exposed to a depth of the level of information and the reality of its existence. And that's just so powerful.
There's something I continue to struggle with, right? Does it mean that I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing? I hope not, because I hope that through my work on gender equality internationally, I hope that through my work on responsible business conduct internationally, I'm laying the foundations to set the conditions through which affected rights holders and people who hold less power can start to claim their rights better, can start to have greater agency. So I hope that in my role is creating that space and that ground through which these things can become fertile. And I just think it would be worse for me to just say, well, this is the way the world is, and I'm just going to accept it and take advantage of my position and consolidate that. Because I see people in my community locally kind of talk that way sometimes, and I find it abhorrent. Like, they either don't recognize their privilege, or they do, and they still don't care about trying to help people that have less privilege. And I simply cannot compute that.
This is actually bringing up a memory of mine, and I don't share it often, and here I am on my podcast sharing it. But that's why I love the podcast, because I told you it's a conversation 100% focused in on. And, when I was little, I was 8 years old, and, I grew up Jewish, and I sent to Hebrew school every weekend. And, when I was little, and assuming you're in the same cohort of age as me, there were still a lot of Holocaust survivors in part of the Jewish community. And we had a woman come in very graphic detail, explain her experience to us. And if I'm telling this story almost 40 years later, is because that day changed my life. When you just talked about very clearly kind of almost opening to the door of the depth of humanity and seeing what's possible when you don't advocate and when you don't work to make sure certain things that humans can do don't happen, they happen. So to me, it's a privilege to people who, it's good for them. No one should be exposed to that information. But if you are exposed to that different information, at least for me, I can't speak for others, really drove the message, at least that my upbringing brought on, is that an injustice for one is an injustice for all. If we're going to let certain things happen in the world and not speak up about them, you open the door for a lot of things to happen. And being exposed to that is traumatic, even if you are not the person to have experienced it, to understand. I was thinking about this the other day because and some people, unfortunately, are even exposed to that earlier in life with even less frameworks to be able to process that. But if anything, take on people's experience and respect of being exposed to that and saying, well, now what? What am I going to do in my sphere of influence to make, honestly, the world a better place?
I mean, this is it. And it sounds corny. And I hate to
Yeah,
have to say that, but I'm saying
yeah.
that because of the era we're in right now, where selfishness and ignoring other people who are suffering is somehow seen as a virtue and seen as the right way to be. And this is what I can't get my head around. And firstly, I'm sorry that you suffered that shock, right? And that realization, but I'm grateful that you did, because as someone who also has Jewish heritage, I think there is that sense of responsibility that comes with being amongst your surviving community towards other people that are struggling or are suffering. And when you have that sense of gratitude for even just being here and being okay, then I just feel there's an ethical compulsion to try to do something to, as you put it, make the world a better place. And it really is that simple. And I guess when I wrote that paper and I learned about those things, it was a hunger to continue to learn, but it was the sense of possibility, the sense of maybe I can have the agency here. So I know that sometimes people will say, well, I can't do anything about that because it's on the other side of the world and I can maybe give money to a charity, but how do I know that it's going to be used well? And therefore I just won't bother. And I understand that. But with the expertise I was building and the relationships I was building, I saw maybe I could make a difference and maybe I was one of the right people to get involved in that space. And that's what compelled me to do it. And I hope that's been a positive thing.
Okay, let's take
Can we
that.
talk about trauma for a second, Alison? Because,
Okay.
you work in communities that are affected by mining, and you know that I'm writing this book at the moment on remedy with Dr. Fabiana Di Lorenzo and Dr. Victoria Gronwald. And I'm actually reading a book just now about intergenerational trauma from a very personal point of view, because I want to understand how trauma gets passed down through generations, either epigenetically in our actual biology and chromosomes or through our psychology because of our parents' behavior or grandparents' behaviors or belief systems or, et cetera, or even just how communities come to have certain norms. And so I'm really, really interested in that. And I think as you start to look at trauma and intergenerational trauma as a thing, it gives me even greater compulsion to take action on injustices today. Because firstly, there's this whole legacy of trauma that we have in so many communities for harms that have been caused at a macro political level, whether that's to do with the Holocaust or to do with colonialism or to do with the ways certain wars are being fought at this moment in Sudan, in Israel, Palestine, in Ukraine. But I feel really strongly that processes of reparation, of healing, of reconciliation, of remedy are so paramount to building a society and a civilization that is fit for the challenges that the world is going to throw at us because of how we are changing it materially. We're changing it biologically. We're changing systems, hydrological systems, climatological systems, etc. So as a social performance expert, how much has trauma come into your thinking and your practice? Because I'd really like to learn that from you, because it's always been in the periphery, but it's now coming more central into how I think about things.
What a question. And I don't know if this is the right way to answer it, but it's what comes to mind. So, from the experience that I just described, after that, and this was just hearing about trauma, I mean, honestly, and not to minimize the actual experience of trauma, but just hearing about that from the way that I heard it. And I developed this, I couldn't watch the news anymore. Like I was watching always, Thursday night TV with my parents was always the best night. And there was always a million commercial breaks. And usually one of the commercial breaks was the local news. And the local news in the Washington area in the 1980s was never good. It was a very dangerous city growing up in the 80s. And there was always, the local news was a flash of what danger happened that day. And I couldn't watch it. And, I'd run to my room or hide under my parents' covers because obviously if I can't see it, then it's not there, and cover my ears and couldn't physically sit through those 2 minutes of the local news for years.
It would trigger you.
Yeah. And now I understand that, but it developed this sense of empathy. Now, flash forward, and I'm working in Peru. I'm working at Antamina. I'm working in communities. And I don't remember this woman's story in this village where we were that day, but she was visibly emotional. And I then became visibly emotional. And I feel bad right now telling the story. I don't remember what her story was about. I just remember the feeling that I had. And whatever her case was, I felt like we could do something about it. So I come back to, my bosses at the time or the department, and I'm trying to relate this woman's story and my idea of how we could help her. And I'm very distraught. And one of my older colleagues, he said, Allison, whatever the Spanish was, I heard in my head in the English, like, you can't wear your heart on your sleeve all the time. Like, you got to get this emotion under control. You can't just be empathetic to everyone. And he was really annoyed at me. Now, I'm telling this story still years later for a couple of things because I've obviously thought about it because I'm obviously telling it many years later. And I've done a lot of training, and I train people around emotional intelligence and the way to be aware of one's emotions. And in a business context, are all of the emotions appropriate all of the time in a setting? I do believe in emotional intelligence. And as I was actually writing out the values of my firm, Patch Associates, and I always put empathy number one, because then I made peace with that concept afterwards. And I said, well, my empathy has to be part of my superpower then, because I genuinely felt this woman's experience. And that drove me to want to help her in a way that I didn't see anyone else really wanting to help her. I don't know if that was the right response to your question, but that's what I thought of. But back to actually your question around trauma and how it informs practice.
Yeah, that's okay. I think it's something we need to talk about more, right? In our community. Because in mining, there's like this desire to push mines through as fast as possible now because of the concern about critical mineral supply constraints. And unfortunately, I think the way some actors are interpreting that is to get rid of environmental and social safeguards, to avoid free, prior, informed consent and processes of meaningful stakeholder engagement, because they think that that soft, as they would put it, stuff gets in the way of getting mines approved. But I believe it's the opposite. I believe that when you treat people with respect, you try to ensure their dignity is protected, you try to involve them and recognize the agency they are entitled to have for self-determination and for control over their lives, their land, their resources. And you get that you are actually, as a mine, a visitor in this place. Like, there's a humility that we need to bring in to how mining happens that I see many people in the social performance world get, but I don't know that enough of our leadership gets. And so we risk changing processes or reverting to old-fashioned ways of engagement that actually make things worse. And when you go to do that in a context where people may already be traumatized, and it was Paul Capitalus who passed away just a couple of weeks after I saw him at Indaba this year. And I so grieve his passing because he has had so much to share with us about this. But it was in a session on remedy. He spoke about the trauma that people already feel and that minds aren't going into a culturally and socially pristine setting where things work perfectly. And you need to understand those traumas if you're going to be able to work together to develop a mine in a way that has not just the social license to operate, but actually delivers on the promise that that endowment offers to a community. So I think trauma is important. I think healing is important. I think right now, where things are moving ideologically, those words aren't going to be ridiculed and laughed at by certain parts of our community. And that is tragic because actually, if they could engage with those virtues more, they would achieve their goals more easily.
Absolutely agree. I didn't have the privilege of getting to know Paul, but I'm familiar with his work and absolutely agree that his loss is a loss for many and for the practice. And absolutely agree of your reflection, especially in today's age with this narrative that we just need to streamline permitting and forego these community engagement, public hearing processes. I mean, I could build hours on that. So just to say I agree, but I want to reflect on a micro moment, a story that relates to it that exactly reflects what you're saying around mining comes into communities and there's already a community there. There's already a life there. There's already a history there. Whether or not the company chooses to deeply do the work to understand that or not. I used to do this training, did this a couple times, and one in particular in Newmont's site in Suriname. And we were training about how do you build empathy and this point of view into our work. And I was training the security guards, especially the ones who are at the front of the gate of the site, because it was a regular occurrence that community members would come to the gate and want to speak to someone at the mine. And when we got the complaints and grievance system up and running, we were getting complaints that community members were frustrated, how they were treated and that they weren't being allowed in to see somebody at the site. So we were training these security guards on the concept of empathy, and everyone's nodding their head like, what is this, woman coming in to train us about? Then we did role plays. And the role play was the following. I said, one of you take on the role of the community member who came up to the gate. And then one of you is obviously the security guard. And I said, wait, imagine the community member. Now, where is the nearest community? The nearest community was about a 20-minute drive from the site. It was actually an island in the middle of this river near the site in the middle of the jungle where traditional communities live. And I said, so a 20-minute drive. So how long do you think this woman who came up to the gate had to walk that day
Yeah.
to come up to that gate? Oh, several hours. I don't know about you, but it is hot here. And now because of this road, there's no tree cover. She probably came up the road under the hot sun to walk for several hours. So what do you think she would have been doing that day if she wasn't? I don't know, fishing, taking care of her kids, participating in village life, a number of things that usually occupy her day. But for whatever reason, she woke up the day and said, today's the day I walk, say, 3 to 4 hours to go demand to the mine about this issue that is driving me, that this is the best way to spend my day. And then she gets to the gate and you just respond, we were doing the role play. Sorry, ma'am, you don't have an appointment. You can't come in. And
Yeah.
send her off on the way. And you're upset because obviously she's supposed to know she can't come in and is bothering you because you can't do anything. You know that you can't let anybody in who doesn't have an appointment. You're told that. You're not going to lose your job over that. That's your point of view. So then we talked about empathy and we practiced the scenario again. And I said, how could you in that moment demonstrate and honor the fact that she just did this? Well, I probably should have asked her if she wanted a glass of water. I had a water cooler there. I probably could have had her sit in the air-conditioned little cabin that we had at the security gate for a while to kind of regain her strength. I kind of probably could just have listened to her. I wasn't really busy. She clearly had a lot to say and made better effort of at least calling and getting her information and, figuring out what is the procedure really, et cetera, et cetera. So I said the result was the same. She wasn't able to see anyone else at the mine that day. You ended up sending her on her way in this fictitious scenario in a way that honored her experience, her perspective, whatever was going on with her, you respected that. That when you talk about, we don't know what happened in this woman's life that made her wake up and say, today I'm leaving my village to walk 4 hours in the jungle sun to talk to these people who are making me this mad.
And interestingly, it's so great that Newmont had, the sense to do that type of training, because actually, from a broader security point of view, that woman would have gone away with an additional grievance as to how she had been treated. And you just don't want an accumulation of grievances. So if just in the act of how you treat someone, and you won't solve the original grievance, but at least you don't create another one. You're helping maintain broader security and mitigating risk for the organization. So that's a great story.
Okay, switching gears. The time has just flown by in this conversation. With all of this experience and interesting life view and professional view, what emerging issues do you think the mining industry should be more focused on?
Well, we spoke about permitting. I think that is very hot topic at the moment. And I think that understanding the ways you expedite permitting, it may be actually just about building the capacity of government departments. I know, for example, permitting in the European Union countries is held up because agencies just don't have the experience in particular minerals and their risks, or they don't have enough of people in those agencies because they're not haven't traditionally been mining nations in some cases, and so they just don't have the capacity. So actually sometimes it's just about human capital, and getting the right human resources in place is a very simple way of expediting permitting rather than necessarily slashing or taking a chainsaw, let's say, to processes that should ultimately avoid conflict in the longer term. So I think permitting is one thing. We spoke about trauma. I think that's another thing we need to all start thinking about more, not least because I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the world. We are, if you look at general indices around democracy and freedom, have been in decline for the last several years, and now increasingly the case also in Western democracies, in inverted commas. And also conflict is on the rise. So to put those two things together, there is going to be more trauma within our communities and also elsewhere. And that makes being skilled at avoiding trauma, but also remedying, reconciling, and so on is really, really important. The other thing I just don't see enough like action on is making mining more circular. Like, I just don't understand why in policy arenas, in some conversations, not all, people still think circularity is just about recycling, and they don't understand that a silver bullet for handling a whole bunch of environmental and human rights issues, if you can really build more circular mindsets, designs, processes into how mines are developed and run. So I really would love to see much more attention on that. I guess in my role as the chair of the Sustainability Committee for the Investing in African Mining in Indaba, very long name, we think about what are the frontier issues, and that's what we try to get on the agenda. And I think the other thing is corruption and anti-corruption, because as we see the risk of conflict increasing, as we see more people being made vulnerable and thus exploitable, as we see leaders eschewing responsible business conduct and trying to not be held accountable, as we're seeing the foreign corrupt practices essentially being put on hold, corruption risks increase. And I think the ordinary person may not always understand why corruption is an issue, but at the end of the day, corruption leads to harm of people in very real material ways. And I could describe several pathways through which that happens. But again, it's another silver bullet issue that if we can be more robust and more effective, we can do a lot for our sector. So I think that's a risk that's elevating where we need more attention. So those three things: permitting, remedy trauma, four things: circularity and anti-corruption. I mean, of course, I'm going to say gender because of the pushback on DEI. I can't finish without saying that. Hugely important to me, to many of the people I work with, to many of the communities in which I've worked. Gender equality is important for women and men alike. It is just so sorely misunderstood, misrepresented by certain political interests who spread disinformation to manipulate people to vote against their own class interests and their own personal identity interests as well. And that breaks my heart because it's an enormous disservice to over 50% of our population women, but also to the other 50% of our population men who feel compelled to perform certain types of masculinities that may ultimately harm them. And I really want to see us make more progress on that.
Each one of those 5 bullets. Oof, there's nothing like a podcast that makes you just want to talk and talk more. Thank you for that. But before we go, in just the last minute, for those listening to your story, your career, the type of work that you do, what advice do you have for others to succeed in your field?
So I think, and I'm going to say this because it's in the moment, right? I'm just going to find the email I sent this morning to the ladies on the Gender Equality Advisory Council for the G7, because we were just reflecting on the speech that Mark Carney had made, his victory speech this morning. And as he took, the premiership for Canada, And I want to quote him because it made me cry, because I think that we need to bring this ethos into every piece of our life and not just our sector. And this is because I'm a slushy woman and I'm proud to be so, and because I give a shit about people. He said, "We do things because they're right, not because they're easy. And we, as Canadians, see kindness as a virtue, not as a weakness." He also said, "We become just by doing just acts, and brave by doing brave acts. And when we are kind, kindness grows. When we seek unity, unity grows." And I think that message from him really resonates with me, really resonates with how I live my life. It resonates with how I hope Levin Sources shows up in the world. I don't think kindness makes you weak. I think kindness makes you stronger. And I think it makes you more able to build allyship and to cooperate and to drive change. It doesn't mean that you're a pushover, because sometimes the kindest thing to do is to say no because you don't have the time, it's not going to be a priority, you don't want to let people down, or because you're not the right person for the job. Kindness doesn't mean that you become a yes person, but it just means saying, we're going to do this because it's better for everyone. And I would really like to live in a world and work in a sector where that was kind of the guiding rule.
Absolutely agree. Estelle, this was an outstanding conversation. I wholeheartedly thank you. And thank you for being part of this podcast.
And thank you for inviting me. It's always nice to talk to you, Alison. I can't wait to have another dinner with you in person soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please like, provide a 5-star review, and amplify.